Good morning, friends. One of the things we talked about this past Sunday was how the disciples of John the Baptist started to think more and more like the Pharisees. As they ask their question about fasting, we get the sense that they have started to care less about the actual meaning and purpose of fasting and more about viewing it as a religious obligation that must be maintained according to their own standards. And while life as a child of God certainly involves various obligations, if those obligations are seen merely as obligations, divorced from their God given meaning and purpose, separated from God's standards for those activities, well, that becomes an easy recipe and a dangerous recipe for legalism. And the Pharisees, whom John's disciples were starting to emulate, were certainly well known for such legalism. In fact, consider something that Jesus says in Matthew 23. Speaking of the Pharisees, he says, "They tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to move them with their finger." Now, Jesus goes on in the remainder of the chapter laying out several charges against the Pharisees, but this is the first, and therefore worthy of special consideration. They tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and then put those burdens on people, is what Jesus says. Through their legalism, through all their rules making and keeping, they make life harder than it needs to be. Much harder, in fact, because, again, the scribes and Pharisees had taken God's law and added so many more rules to it, pedantic, nitpicky rules of their own crafting, to which they demanded the strictest of adherence. But consider all this in contrast to the familiar words of Jesus in Matthew 11. "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." And of course, there's so much here. First, consider the comparison between Jesus and the Pharisees. What the Pharisees demand requires a massive effort. It's a laborious task, such that those who attempt to undertake their form of legalism become greatly burdened. They carry their heavy loads under great duress. But Jesus says that his yoke, or in other words, his burden, the burden that he requires his people to bear, is much easier. Comparatively speaking, it is a light load. Also notice that Jesus says, "For I am gentle and lowly in heart." The Pharisees were not noted for sympathy or gentleness at all. There's very little room for compassion or empathy when you have based your life and your requirements of others on legalism and works-based righteousness. So far from being lowly of heart, the Pharisees tended to be haughty and arrogant. And yet Jesus, who actually deserved to have all honor and glory, to be revered and have all worship of every sort directed his way, well, he was instead humble. Rather than being eager to pile on the hurt, Jesus was compassionate, seeking to help people with the truth rather than burdening them even more. At the same time, we see that Jesus does not say he has no burden to give his followers. The Pharisees were seeking a salvation based on works, which was a heavy burden to bear indeed, but according to the grace of Jesus Christ, salvation is not based on works. The Pharisees presented law and works, Jesus presented grace and faith, but that does not mean that there is no burden at all in coming to Jesus. After all, we've already talked at some length about how Jesus clearly lays out the cost of following him. And just this past Sunday, we were again reminded that we must be willing to lay down our lives and pick up our crosses if we truly wish to follow Jesus. And so one might ask, well, how in the world could that be considered a lighter burden than that which the Pharisees required? After all, the Pharisees might have a list a mile long of things you couldn't do or couldn't say or that you had to do, but still, isn't it more strict, more daunting to demand that you must hand over everything you are and everything that you have? And I suppose that if you wanted to have that perspective, you could say that. But at the same time, when we truly understand the grace that Jesus was putting forward, we realize that even the call to deny oneself, if you're denying yourself so that you can follow a God who is gracious, then in comparison, that is a much lighter burden than anything else. And here's why. Because in legalism, you've got to earn everything. And if you fail, it's on you. There's no empathy. There's no compassion. And if the one you're trying to please doesn't feel like being pleased, then there's nothing that you can do that will ever actually be good enough, because there will always be something to nitpick. And so you're under the microscope at every turn, having your flaws pointed out, berated for them, condemned for them, or because of this fearing to have your flaws pointed out at every turn, at every step along the way. And that is where the burden really comes from. And friends, let us please realize that this very same kind of legalism is dominating our world and our culture right now. Because I can't help but draw a parallel between the mindset of the Pharisees and the current cancel culture that dominates society today. The tax collectors and other sinners wouldn't toe the mark that the Pharisees had set, and so the Pharisees canceled them. Don't speak to those people. Don't eat with those people. Don't interact with those people. And friends, while it's not of the same religious variety, at least it doesn't appear to be the same way today, it's just that the standard that is used has shifted. It's the same legalism, just a different foundation for determining what is right or wrong. And if people don't comply with that standard, even if it shifts, the result is the same. Don't speak to those people. Don't share anything with those people. Don't interact with those people. And if you do, you might be canceled too. What a burdensome weight that creates, especially because in such a system, there is no forgiveness. We've already mentioned the lack of compassion or empathy, but much more, there is no forgiveness. How many times have we seen someone say something that is deemed offensive in our culture? That person receives tremendous backlash, but even when they publicly apologize, nothing changes. There's no forgiveness. You screwed up and now you're done. But with the Lord, there is forgiveness. Yes, he demands all that we are, but he doesn't demand perfection from us. He knows we're not capable of it, so he doesn't expect it. It's not part of the deal. He just wants us, all of us, our hearts and minds as we are, but seeking as we are to become in his power what he wants us to be. And even in that journey of sanctification, grace continues. We are saved by his grace and we are preserved by his grace. In a legalistic culture, you've got to do everything you can to toe the mark of whatever the standard is for fear of being rejected. But as a child of God, even though we should do everything we can to please him and obey him, it's not based on a fear of rejection. We do everything we can in order to please him and obey him and honor him for love of him and genuine devotion toward him. But in the midst of that, when we do fail, when we do fall, we need not fear rejection, because he understands our weaknesses, and in his mercy there is such abundant forgiveness. And he's promised us that for those who belong to him, who hear his voice and follow, he will never let them go. No one, not even we ourselves, can make us fall out of his hand or rip ourselves from his hand. No one else can rip us from his hand either. He will preserve us according to his grace and love. This is why Jesus is able to say, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." Leave all attempts at earning favor with God or earning salvation. Leave it all behind. You will be crushed under that burden, and it won't get you salvation in any case. And of course, don't expect anyone else to live like that either. Instead, come to Jesus fully. Give yourself to him fully. Yes, he requires all of you, but compared to the burden of the alternative, the grace of Jesus Christ that we receive in his grace is a small burden to bear indeed. And where there is a burden, it is comforted by divine rest and our Lord's most compassionate and gentle care. With this in mind, I pray you have a good and godly day, and Lord willing, I will see you soon.